When Judge Edward Chen laughed at Karoline Leavitt in the middle of her statement, no one expected her calm response to expose a political scandal that would shake the entire courtroom. No one expected the room to change like that. Not in federal court, not with Judge Edward Chen on the bench. The atmosphere had been exactly what you'd expect from a high-profile hearing. Cold, careful, coiled. Cameras weren't allowed, but the energy was electric, like the whole building in San Jose was holding its breath. Karoline Leavitt stood at the defendant's table, not with a team of slick attorneys, not even flanked by a colleague, alone. No mic in front of her, just a yellow legal pad and her voice. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't even supposed to be speaking, but the judge had given her 5 minutes. No one knew what she was going to say. She wasn't on trial, but her credibility, her life's work, her entire name was. She stepped forward, cleared her throat once, and began. "I didn't come here to be believed," she said. "I came here because the truth doesn't need applause." There was a pause. It wasn't a headline grabber. It wasn't dramatic. But the room tensed up. A few reporters scribbled faster. Even the court clerk looked up from her notes. Judge Chen leaned back slightly in his seat. Karoline continued, this time looking directly at the people who had dismissed her, at the attorneys whispering behind expensive pens and polished teeth. "You all think I came here to protect myself," she said, "but you're wrong. I came here to protect the women who can't afford to stand in this room." That's when it happened. The judge, stone-faced, always composed, let out a short, dry laugh. Not loud, just a sharp exhale with a half-smile that curled on one side of his face. It was gone as quickly as it came, but the damage was done. Gasps didn't echo, but they existed. A ripple, like someone had dropped a pin in water. Karoline didn't blink. The bailiff looked down awkwardly. The plaintiff's counsel nudged each other with tight grins, and somewhere in the back, a freelance journalist from Oakland whispered to her seatmate, "Did he just laugh at her?" You could feel it, that shift, like everyone was suddenly paying attention in a new way. Not to the case, but to her. Karoline let the silence hang for a second longer. She tilted her head just slightly, then gave the kind of smile people give when they've already decided what they're going to do, and no one in the room is ready for it. "I appreciate your reaction, Your Honor," she said calmly. "Most people laugh when they hear something they wish wasn't true." That was it. Not angry, not disrespectful, just solid, like a stone dropped in a river. For a moment, even Judge Chen didn't respond. His face froze in that half smile. His gavel didn't move. The whole courtroom felt like it was leaning forward, and then she pivoted. Karoline turned toward the gallery, not to the bench, not to the attorneys, but to the citizens watching. She continued, not raising her voice, not asking for pity. "I was 19 the first time I reported something that made powerful people uncomfortable," she said. "You think that gets easier? It doesn't. But silence doesn't get lighter either. You carry that too." From there, she walked the room through her timeline. Not in a rehearsed, performative way, but like someone walking you through a story over coffee, only instead of coffee, it was a courtroom full of suits and press. How she uncovered a ring of political donors paying off complaints. How she was shut down. How every door closed one after another. How this current hearing wasn't about her actions, but about silencing the voice behind them. As she spoke, the temperature changed. One of the attorneys, a man named Clark Donnelly, shuffled his papers nervously. Another leaned over to whisper something, but stopped midway through. Karoline's voice never cracked, but what she said next was what truly made the air thick. "I don't care if you believe me. I care that you know what happens when people like me stop talking." But this was only the beginning. Something about the judge's laugh had done more than shift the mood. It cracked something open, and Karoline wasn't done yet. To understand why that courtroom moment meant so much, you have to know who Karoline Leavitt really is. Not the headlines, not the courtroom transcripts, not the political tags they throw around when someone won't shut up and sit down. The truth is simpler, messier, and far more human. She was born in Visalia, California. Not exactly a place people watch for rising stars. Her mom worked nights at a senior care home. Her dad fixed tires, brakes, alternators, whatever needed fixing. They didn't have a lot, but they always had food, and her parents never missed one of her school debates. Karoline was smart early. Not just the good grades kind of smart. The kind that asked too many questions. The kind that made teachers pause and say things like, That's a good point, but maybe save it for after class. By 15, she was writing opinion pieces for the local paper. By 17, she'd gotten herself into Cal State Fresno on a full ride. She studied journalism, not because she wanted to be famous, but because she hated when people lied and got away with it. One professor once told her, "You can't go into every room like you're the only person telling the truth." She never forgot that, but she also didn't stop. After graduation, she got a job at a small station in Modesto, the kind of the job where you cover missing pets, budget meetings, and high school parades. But she worked fast, learned faster, and eventually started producing her own investigative segments. And then came the councilwoman story. Karoline uncovered that a sitting councilwoman had used city funds to pay for travel, except the trips weren't related to city business. They were private retreats, complete with spa treatments and luxury hotels. The evidence was airtight. Documents, receipts, even timestamps from hotel surveillance cameras. Her station didn't air it. They called it too risky. She was told to drop it. But Karoline didn't. She sent the evidence to a watchdog nonprofit and published the story herself on a blog she'd quietly started months earlier. It went viral. The councilwoman resigned within the week. That was the first time Karoline lost a job because of the truth. By 26, she'd done it 4 more times. She built a small following online. People who respected her. People who hated her. People who called her a troublemaker, a liar, a girl who just wants attention. But she never chased controversy. She chased answers. And that's what brought her to the story that landed her in court. It started with a tip, an anonymous email, vague, nervous-sounding, about hush payments, about campaign donations funneled through shell organizations, about someone silencing young aides who had tried to speak out. Karoline didn't know how deep it would go, but she started digging. She tracked down old interns, campaign staffers, accountants. She pieced together financial records, metadata from emails, even an internal memo buried in the archive of a now-defunct website. And just when she thought she was getting somewhere, she was hit with the lawsuit. Defamation, libel, invasion of privacy, everything but treason. But the problem wasn't just the lawsuit. It was who filed it. A powerful donor, deeply connected, the kind of man who made phone calls that changed job titles, the kind of man who wasn't used to being exposed. And Karoline wasn't just facing a courtroom battle. Her name was dragged across networks she'd never even worked for. They questioned her credibility, her motives, even her mental health. People started pulling away. Friends, contacts, even people who used to praise her work now called her too much. But Karoline didn't stop. She packed her things, took a rented car, and drove herself to San Jose, where the hearing was being held, and walked into that courtroom with nothing but a binder, her voice, and the belief that truth didn't need a team of lawyers to stand tall. But what no one knew was that Karoline had something up her sleeve, something that could unravel every name connected to the case, and the judge's laugh had only made her more determined to use it. The case on paper looked clean. Doyle v. Leavitt, a wealthy businessman, Gerald Doyle, accusing a freelance journalist of defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But anyone who had followed even a fragment of Karoline's work knew this wasn't just about false claims or personal attacks. This was about exposure. Doyle wasn't just some angry donor trying to protect his reputation. He had spent the last 2 decades building an empire behind the scenes, moving money between super PACs and consulting firms like chess pieces, never drawing too much attention, never needing to. That changed when Karoline published her findings. She didn't post on some fringe conspiracy forum. She dropped a carefully written, fully sourced investigative piece that outlined how campaign funds linked to Doyle had repeatedly shown up in private settlement agreements, quiet payouts to women who had worked for the campaigns of elected officials Doyle had backed. None of these settlements ever reached court. Most included NDAs so restrictive they were practically gag orders. One woman, listed in Karoline's report only as MR, had been paid $140,000 through a shell firm based in Flagstaff, Arizona. Another, a former communications intern, received $80,000. The settlements had vague phrasing, phrases like workplace incident, verbal discomfort, or misaligned expectations. Karoline had the documents, and that terrified people. But instead of responding with transparency or denial, Doyle's team did what people with money often do. They sued her, hard, fast, and with lawyers who billed more in a day than Karoline had made the entire year. The hearing in San Jose wasn't the trial yet. It was a preliminary injunction hearing. Doyle wanted the court to force Karoline to remove the article and stop sharing any of the related documents. His lawyers framed it as a matter of safety, privacy, and reputational harm. They said she was stirring up public chaos and endangering innocent people. They used phrases like reckless disregard for the truth and malicious intent. But Karoline knew better, and so did a few people sitting in that gallery. One of them was a woman named Elise Monroe. She wasn't a whistleblower. She wasn't a reporter. She was a former scheduler for a congressman whose campaign had been funded by Doyle's PAC. She'd reached out to Karoline just 2 weeks before the hearing, saying only, "If this goes public, they'll destroy me. But if you're willing to fight, I'll speak." Karoline had met her in a coffee shop in San Mateo. Elise had come wearing sunglasses despite the rain and had sat with her hands clenched around her cup the entire time. "They said if I talked, I'd never work again. Anywhere," she whispered. Karoline listened, took notes, didn't push. That conversation didn't make it into the article yet, but it sat in the folder on Karoline's lap that day in court, ready if the moment came. The courtroom itself was clinical, beige walls, polished wood. Judge Chen presided with his usual calm, rarely showing emotion. Karoline's request to represent herself wasn't denied. He seemed almost curious about it. Doyle's legal team, led by a smug attorney named Spencer Hall, didn't hide their disdain. "She's not a lawyer," Hall had said during the opening remarks. "She's a blogger with a chip on her shoulder." Karoline didn't flinch then either. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to argue. She just waited. And when the judge gave her 5 minutes to speak, a courtesy rarely extended, she took the room by the throat. That was the moment he laughed. That short, sharp sound that changed everything. And once Karoline fired back with that line, most people laugh when they hear something they wish wasn't true. The balance shifted. People stopped seeing her as just a woman in over her head. They started seeing her as someone who knew more than she was saying. But the hearing wasn't over, and Karoline hadn't shown her full hand yet. Not the emails, not the voice recording, not the sworn statement Elise had slipped her just the night before. The courtroom had shifted, but the real impact was still waiting. Judge Chen didn't say anything for a few seconds after Karoline's remark. His expression leveled, hands folded tightly in front of him, lips thinned out like he was tasting something bitter he couldn't quite spit out. But the silence spoke. It said he'd misjudged her. Spencer Hall stood up, clearly rattled by how the courtroom had leaned in Karoline's direction. He tried to push the momentum back with polished legalese. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the witness is grandstanding," he began. "This is a hearing, not a podium for political theater." Karoline didn't move. She didn't interrupt. Judge Chen raised a hand, not to silence her, but to silence him. "Mr. Hall," the judge said, "she was granted 5 minutes. She still has 2. Spencer stepped back with a half smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Karoline turned slightly toward the gallery again. She didn't need to win over the judge. She needed the people watching, and they were. "Let me be clear," she said. "This isn't about Gerald Doyle being offended. This is about the truth making its way out of a back room and into the daylight. That makes people uncomfortable." She reached down and picked up the folder sitting neatly beside her chair. "I wasn't going to share this today. I didn't want to expose anyone else. But I realize now, if I don't say this, it'll never see the light of day." Hall took a step forward again, but Judge Chen raised his palm. "Let her finish." Karoline opened the folder, pulled out a printed transcript, and held it in front of her like a teacher reading out loud. "This is a sworn statement, dated last Friday. It was delivered to me by a former employee of Congressman Denton's campaign. The statement outlines how, in June of last year, she was pressured into signing a non-disclosure agreement after being subjected to what she describes as repeated verbal harassment by senior staffers. Her exit was paid for with funds routed through an entity connected to Mr. Doyle's network. Gasps weren't loud, but they happened." Karoline continued. "This employee asked not to be named. She's afraid. But she signed her statement under penalty of perjury, and she included screenshots of text messages, emails, even calendar entries showing meetings with Mr. Doyle's associates." Judge Chen looked down, pen tapping lightly against his legal pad. For the first time that day, he leaned forward. "Do you have a copy of this statement for the court?" he asked. Karoline nodded and handed it to the bailiff. Spencer Hall tried again. "Your Honor, we have not had time to review this. I imagine that's because you didn't know it existed, Karoline said, voice calm. Hall flinched. Not visibly, but enough. Judge Chen skimmed the first page, then looked at Karoline. Are you aware that introducing new evidence during an injunction hearing is highly irregular? I'm aware, Karoline said. But if the goal of this hearing is to assess whether what I published was fabricated or malicious, I think this statement supports the idea that what I published was just the beginning. Silence. It was hard to tell if the courtroom was in awe or in shock, maybe both. The moment wasn't explosive. It was heavy, dense. Judge Chen closed the folder slowly, like it had suddenly gained weight. Proceed, he said quietly. Karoline stepped back, and for the first time she looked tired. Not defeated, but tired, like someone who's been carrying something alone for too long. Across the aisle, Gerald Doyle sat motionless, face flushed, jaw clenched, tapping one thumb against his thigh rhythmically. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. And then, just as the judge turned to address the next motion, Karoline said something no one expected. There's a recording too. Everything stopped. She said it without drama. No raised voice, just those 4 words, and then silence. But she didn't press play. Not yet, because Karoline knew timing was everything, and the room wasn't quite ready for what came next. The courtroom wasn't quiet. It was frozen. No rustling, no side conversations, not even the sound of someone shifting in their seat. Just the weight of Karoline's words hanging midair. There's a recording too. Judge Chen stared at her, pen now still in his hand. He didn't speak right away. Neither did Spencer Hall. Even Doyle had stopped tapping his thumb. Karoline let the silence stretch just enough to remind everyone who had control now. Then she added, "It was given to me anonymously, and I've had it verified by 2 independent analysts. If the court permits, I'd like to enter it into the record." Hall regained his voice first. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. We were not provided this material in discovery, and we have no idea of its contents or origin. For all we know, it could be doctored." Judge Chen didn't blink. "Was this recording referenced in the published article?" Karoline nodded. "Not explicitly. I was still confirming its authenticity when the article went live. But now that my credibility is being called into question, I believe it's relevant." Hall stepped forward again. "This is hearsay. It's potentially unlawful recording." "It was recorded in the state of Nevada," Karoline cut in, "which only requires one-party consent. The speaker on the recording was one of the aides involved in a previously settled complaint. She was the one who shared it with me." Chen looked down for a moment, flipping through the statement Karoline had handed over just minutes before. "Does this aide's identity appear in your written statement?" Karoline hesitated, then said quietly, "Yes." Chen exhaled slowly. "Provide a copy to the court." The bailiff crossed the room again, taking the flash drive Karoline had prepared, just in case. She didn't expect it to be used, not today. But she carried it anyway. It was a 5-minute clip, and no, it wasn't graphic. It wasn't violent. But what it revealed was damning. The recording started mid-conversation. A man's voice, calm and too familiar. "Just sign the paper, Megan. It'll all go away. You don't want this to turn into a media thing. We'll handle it. You'll be taken care of." A pause. Then the woman's voice, young, shaking. "Why do I have to sign something if I didn't do anything wrong?" Silence. Then the man again. "Because people like Doyle don't leave things unfinished. We're protecting you too." Click. That was it. No names were used. But the implication was loud. It confirmed what Karoline had written. That people were being pressured, quietly, methodically, and sometimes with financial incentives, to stay silent. The courtroom didn't erupt. That's not how these things work. But the atmosphere cracked. You could feel it. The quiet looked different now. No longer composed, more like fragile. Judge Chen leaned back again, slower this time, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, "I assume you have authentication reports for this recording?" "I do," she replied. "And the court will want those, as well as a transcript." "I have both prepared." Hall tried to object again, but his voice lacked the force it had earlier. He looked at Doyle, who finally leaned in and whispered something. Hall's eyes widened just slightly, then narrowed. "We'd like a recess," he said quickly. 10 minutes. Judge Chen nodded. "Granted, we'll reconvene at 2:30. The gavel didn't slam, it just lowered, like everything else. Measured, weighty, deliberate. As the room emptied out, Karoline sat back down, her hands folded, her face expressionless. Not smug, not victorious, just still, like someone who had been underwater for too long and was finally allowed to breathe again. In the hallway, the whispering began. Reporters typing on phones with shaky thumbs, attorneys murmuring with wide eyes. No one was sure what would happen next, but everyone knew this case wasn't about suppressing a headline anymore. It was about keeping a system intact, and Karoline had just torn a piece of it loose, but she wasn't finished. There was one more witness, one person who hadn't been named publicly yet, who had stayed silent until today. When the courtroom resumed, the tone was completely different. What had started as a formality had evolved into something heavier, something no one in the room could shrug off anymore. Karoline wasn't some rogue reporter spinning theories. She had receipts, statements, and now a voice. A real one. Fragile and tired, but unmistakably human. Judge Chen looked more alert now, less skeptical. Even the way he adjusted his glasses before speaking hinted at something new, maybe respect, maybe just caution. "Ms. Leavitt," he said after glancing at his clerk, "you mentioned earlier that there's another witness connected to your article. Someone who has not yet been identified?" Karoline stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. She came forward just this morning." You could hear a pen drop. Spencer Hall didn't say a word. He just looked at Doyle, who had leaned back in his chair, arms crossed like a man watching something he couldn't control anymore. "Would the witness be willing to submit a statement?" the judge asked. "She already has," Karoline replied, "but she's here today." Heads turned. Even people in the gallery leaned forward. Karoline turned slightly and pointed to the back of the room. From the second row, a woman stood. Brown coat, no makeup, flat shoes. She looked like someone you'd pass in a grocery store and not think twice about. Her name was Talia Wynn, and until this morning she hadn't even told her husband what she knew. She walked to the front, like her knees barely trusted her, and when the bailiff opened the gate, she stepped through and sat in the witness chair without being asked. Judge Chen narrowed his eyes. "You understand that this is not a trial, and that any testimony offered here is informal and may be subject to later verification?" "I do," she said quietly. "And are you prepared to speak today?" "Yes." Talia kept her hands folded in her lap and stared straight ahead. "I worked for one of Doyle's satellite firms, Thorne and Clyde Public Relations," she began. "My job was to scrub stories, articles that could damage the reputation of our clients. My job was to pay off reporters, pressure editors, and, in some cases, offer incentives to make things disappear." Karoline didn't flinch. She already knew this, but hearing it out loud changed the room again. "I was asked," Talia continued, "to help manage the fallout from Karoline's article before it went public. I was told to find out who she spoke with and how much she knew. When I reported back that she had proof, documents, emails, they told me to destroy anything we couldn't trace. They said if she didn't back down, we'd file, fast, and drown her in legal paperwork." Spencer Hall stood up. "Your Honor, this is highly—" "She's testifying voluntarily," Karoline said, "and everything she just said matches the documents in my folder." Judge Chen raised a hand. "Mr. Hall, sit down." Talia swallowed. "I couldn't sleep for months. Every night I told myself she'd be fine, that someone would protect her. But when the lawsuit hit and I saw how hard they came at her, I couldn't keep pretending." Her voice cracked. "I was part of it. I didn't write the threats, but I helped build the machinery that delivered them." She looked at Karoline. "I'm sorry." For a second, Karoline looked like she might speak, but she didn't. She just gave a slow, slight nod, acknowledging the moment, but not consuming it. Judge Chen tapped his pen lightly once and leaned into the microphone. "The court will take this statement under review. I will also allow Ms. Leavitt to submit the documents for record consideration. At this point, I'm denying the motion for a preliminary injunction." The words hit the room like a current. Doyle didn't react, but Spencer Hall did. His jaw tightened, his face flushed. He leaned toward Doyle, whispering harshly, but it was over. At least, this part was. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't stand up or turn to the press. She just sat back down, folded her papers neatly, and looked at Talia. Really looked at her, not with judgment, not even with forgiveness, just with understanding. But what she did outside the courtroom, what happened just hours later, that's what turned this from a legal win into a national moment, and no one saw it coming. By the time Karoline stepped out of the courthouse, the reporters were already waiting. Not a massive crowd, maybe a dozen or so, but their cameras were on, their microphones stretched forward like fishing rods. Everyone smelled a headline. She didn't speak right away. Her phone was buzzing in her coat pocket. Calls, texts, notifications. It didn't matter. She wasn't thinking about her inbox. She was thinking about what came next. A younger reporter from KQED asked the first question. "Ms. Leavitt, do you have anything to say now that the motion was denied?" Karoline looked up. "Yes," she said simply, "but I'm not going to say it here." That threw them. She wasn't playing the game. No media blitz victory lap, no clip-worthy quote for evening news. She stepped into a waiting rideshare, not a black car or a hired driver, just a Toyota with a cracked dashboard and a driver named Keon, who recognized her from a podcast she'd been on months ago. "You're the one who took on Doyle, right?" he asked. Karoline nodded. Keon chuckled. "You got guts. Where to?" "City Hall," she said. "I need a podium." 15 minutes later, she stood in front of the flagpole steps of San Jose City Hall with a few printed pages in hand and a camera phone live streaming to her modest but loyal online following. No official press, no big network cameras, just her voice, and whoever was willing to listen. "I know what's going to happen next," she began. "They're going to call this a personal vendetta. They'll say I'm obsessed, unstable, bitter. They'll roll out statements and press releases. Some will pretend they didn't know. Others will double down." She looked straight into the phone. "And they'll hope that the people who matter stop paying attention." Then she held up a copy of Talia Wynn's statement and flipped the page. But here's what they don't realize. This isn't about one lawsuit. It's not about one donor or one journalist. This is about a system that lets powerful men buy silence and manipulate truth, and then punishes anyone who doesn't play along. She spoke for 8 minutes straight. No teleprompter, no filter. Her voice cracked once, but not from nerves, from something deeper, from knowing she wasn't alone anymore. "This morning, 3 other women contacted me. They saw what happened in court. They said they're ready to talk." She paused. "I don't want to be anyone's hero. I don't want a Netflix deal. I want accountability. I want protections for people who speak up. I want answers for the women who had to carry this for years in silence." That clip hit social media like wildfire. Within hours, it had been viewed over 3 million times. By nightfall, 2 of the elected officials mentioned in Karoline's original report had released vague statements about reviewing internal practices. By morning, one of them had resigned. Karoline didn't go home that night. She sat in a coffee shop off Lincoln Avenue, answering messages from women she didn't know, hearing their stories, writing them down. Some were heartbreaking, others infuriating. But they were all pieces of the same machine, quietly grinding people down while the public never noticed. She wasn't chasing fame. She wasn't interested in viral moments. She was building something. By the end of the week, Karoline announced the launch of an independent platform, Signal Line, dedicated to protecting and publishing the stories of whistleblowers, staffers, and overlooked voices with nowhere else to go. It wasn't flashy. There were no corporate sponsors, just a single page, a secure upload form, and Karoline's name. People noticed, not just activists and journalists, lawyers, investigators, former insiders. The tide didn't just turn, it started eroding everything Doyle and others like him had built in the dark. Because now someone had flipped the light on. But this story wasn't just about truth or exposure, it was about the cost of silence. And Karoline paid that cost so others wouldn't have to. The courtroom drama faded, but its echo kept moving through headlines, inboxes, podcasts, office chatter, and family dinner tables. People weren't just talking about Karoline Leavitt anymore. They were talking about what she represented. In Bakersfield, a legal secretary quit her job and emailed Karoline, said she had copies of internal memos from a campaign cleanup 10 years back. In Stockton, a retired finance director dropped off an envelope at a local library with 4 pages of handwritten notes about fund transfers and shell donors. And in Sacramento, a public radio host dedicated an entire hour to reading Karoline's speech live on air, word for word, with no commentary. This wasn't noise, it was movement. Gerald Doyle didn't go to jail, at least not yet. His legal team kept busy trying to control the damage, filing new motions, leaking statements, spinning the media wheel. But something had cracked. The accusations weren't whispers anymore. They were documented, signed, time-stamped, and no one could pretend they didn't hear them. Karoline didn't change overnight either. She still drove the same beat-up sedan, still wore jeans that didn't fit right at the ankles, still brewed the cheapest grocery store coffee at home. But her inbox, God, her inbox, it overflowed with names, stories, leads, people who weren't afraid anymore. She never called herself a leader, but people followed anyway. Late one night, maybe a week after the hearing, she sat alone in her apartment, lights off, except for her laptop screen. A single email caught her eye. Subject line, "You saved me." It was short, just a paragraph. No name, no return address. Just a woman saying she'd almost signed an NDA last year after being harassed by a man connected to the Doyle network. But after watching Karoline speak outside City Hall, she changed her mind. "I watched you," the email said, "and for the first time, I didn't feel alone." Karoline stared at it for a long time. Then she leaned back in her chair, the hum of her old refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. She didn't reply. She couldn't, but she didn't need to, because that was the moment she realized what the trial had really been about. Not winning, not proving anyone wrong, but breaking the silence. We live in a world where it's easier to discredit someone than to listen, where institutions tell you to take the money, shut your mouth, and move on. And for a long time, that worked, but not anymore. Karoline made people uncomfortable. She forced attention on things nobody wanted to see. And yeah, some still mocked her. Some still called her dramatic, unstable, a liar. But they couldn't ignore her. And when people can't ignore you, that's when things start to change. Judge Edward Chen never addressed his laughter publicly. The court record never reflected it. But everyone in that room remembered it. It wasn't the laugh itself that mattered. It was what came after. It was how Karoline stood in it, unshaken, clear, grounded, and turned it into a moment of truth. Most people would have backed down. She didn't. And that's the lesson. No matter how big the room feels, no matter how alone you are at the microphone, if you know what you're saying is true, say it anyway. Because somewhere, someone is listening. And you may be the reason they finally speak up too. If you found meaning in this story, if it moved you or made you think differently, subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. We tell stories that others try to silence because silence only serves the ones who already have power. Don't let them be the only voices that get heard.